Emergency beacon had been transmitting for 73 cycles when Commander Zyxthala finally made the decision that would haunt her for the rest of her considerably shortened lifespan. Her forearms trembled as she activated the Universal Distress Protocol, sending out a desperate plea across the void of space to any civilization capable of receiving it. The Kethmori had been a proud species once, their crystalline cities spanning 3 star systems, their bioluminescent art forms celebrated throughout the galactic concordance. Now, as she watched the Harvester ship strip-mining another of their worlds through the viewport of their last remaining dreadnought, that pride felt like a cruel joke. The Harvesters had appeared without warning 18 cycles ago, emerging from dark space like a plague of mechanical locusts. They consumed everything, planets, moons, even the very stars themselves, feeding some incomprehensible hunger that drove them across the galaxy. No weapon the Concordance possessed could pierce their adaptive shielding, no strategy could overcome their ruthless efficiency. World after world fell, their populations either enslaved or worse, processed into the biomechanical components that powered the Harvester war machine. The Kethmori fleet, once numbering in the thousands, had been reduced to a handful of ships running silent through the asteroid fields of their homeworld's debris. Zyxthala's communication officer, young Velter, looked up from his console with eyes that had seen too much death for his barely adult age. "Commander, we're receiving acknowledgement signals from 17 different species. Most are offering sympathy but cannot spare military assets." His voice carried the hollow tone of someone who had heard too many promises of aid that never materialized. However, there's one response that's unusual. The signal originates from a species calling themselves humans from a system they designate as Sol. They're requesting our coordinates and tactical situation. The name meant nothing to Zyxthala. In her centuries of service, she had encountered hundreds of species across the galaxy, from the gas-breathing Zephyrians to the silicon-based crystallites, but humans were entirely unknown to her. A quick search through their databases revealed equally little, just scattered references to a small, recently spacefaring civilization from the Outer Rim territories. Primitives, barely past their first interstellar colonies. What could such a backwater species possibly offer that the combined might of the Galactic Concordance could not? But desperation makes pragmatists of even the most prideful commanders. With 17 of her homeworlds already consumed, and the last 3 under siege, Zyxthala found herself willing to grasp at any straw, no matter how slender. She authorized the transmission of their coordinates along with tactical data on the Harvester forces, expecting at best a few outdated patrol craft crewed by well-meaning primitives who would flee the moment they encountered the enemy's overwhelming firepower. What arrived 72 hours later defied every expectation, calculation, and nightmare she had harbored about first contact with an unknown species. The humans didn't announce their arrival with fanfare or diplomatic protocols. There was no grand transmission declaring their peaceful intentions or requesting permission to enter Kethmori space. Instead, reality simply tore. Space itself seemed to unravel in a perfect sphere roughly 50 kilometers in diameter, revealing not the familiar starfield beyond, but an absolute void that hurt to look at directly. From this impossible wound in the fabric of spacetime emerged something that Zyxthala's tactical computer refused to classify as a ship. It was too large, too complex, too alien in its construction to fit any known paradigm of spacecraft design. The vessel, if it could be called that, stretched nearly 200 kilometers from bow to stern, its hull a matte black that seemed to absorb not just light, but the very concept of illumination. Strange geometries twisted across its surface, patterns that made her eyes water and her mind recoil when she tried to follow them to their logical conclusion. But it was not alone. As the tier in space widened, more ships emerged, hundreds of them then thousands. Each was unique in design, ranging from sleek fighters no larger than atmospheric shuttles to massive dreadnoughts that dwarfed even the legendary Titan-class vessels of the extinct progenitor race. Some bristled with weapons that glowed with barely contained energy, while others appeared deceptively peaceful until sensor scans revealed the exotic matter reactions occurring within their cores. The diversity was staggering. It was as if an entire galaxy's worth of military evolution had been compressed into a single fleet. Zyxthala's sensor operator, her voice barely above a whisper, began reading off the impossible numbers. "Commander, I'm detecting." "I can't get an accurate count. My systems keep cycling through estimates. Minimum 10,000 vessels, maximum. The computer won't even display the upper limit." Mass readings are off the scale. Whatever that lead ship is made of, it's denser than collapsed matter but somehow still maintaining structural integrity. The communication board erupted in a symphony of alerts as the human fleet began broadcasting on every frequency simultaneously. But these weren't chaotic transmissions. Each signal was precisely calibrated to the communication protocols of different species within the concordance. They were speaking to everyone at once, in their own languages, using their own cultural markers and diplomatic codes. The humans had somehow acquired and processed the linguistic and cultural databases of dozens of civilizations in the space of a few hours. When the primary communication channel opened, Zyxthala found herself face-to-face with a human for the first time. The being on the screen was smaller than she had expected, bipedal and seemingly fragile, with the pale skin and dark hair common to many carbon-based species. But there was something in its eyes, those strange, forward-facing orbs, that spoke of an intelligence vast and calculating, tempered by something she couldn't immediately identify but which made her instinctively step back from the screen. "Commander Zyxthala of the Kethmori Defense Fleet," the human said, its voice carrying an accent that suggested this was not its native language despite the perfect pronunciation. "I am Admiral Sarah Chen of the Terran Expeditionary Force. We received your distress call and have come to render assistance. Before we proceed, I need you to understand something very clearly. We are not here as saviors or liberators. We are here because the harvesters represent a threat to all organic life in this galaxy, including our own. What we are about to do, we do not for glory or gratitude, but because sometimes the only way to preserve civilization is to become something that civilization fears." Zyxthala felt a chill run through her exoskeleton at those words. There was something in the human's tone, a weight of knowledge and terrible purpose that spoke of experiences beyond her comprehension. "Admiral Chen, with respect, our combined fleets have been unable to penetrate the harvester defenses. Their adaptive shielding technology is beyond anything we've encountered. What makes you believe?" The human's expression shifted slightly, and Zyxthala realized that what she had mistaken for calculation was actually restraint. The Admiral was holding something back, something vast and dangerous that strained against the bonds of her control. "Commander, your species has fought with honor and courage, but you've been fighting the harvesters like they're just another enemy fleet, using conventional tactics against an unconventional threat. The thing about humans is that we've never been particularly conventional. We've spent our entire evolutionary history as persistence predators on a world that wanted us dead, and we've brought those instincts with us to the stars." The transmission cut momentarily, replaced by tactical displays that made Zyxthala's command crew gasp in collective horror. The data showed the harvester fleet in perfect detail, not just their current positions, but their internal structures, their power distribution patterns, even the biological signatures of their enslaved crews. Somehow, impossibly, the humans had managed to completely penetrate every layer of harvester security without firing a single shot. When Admiral Chen's image returned, her smile was the most terrifying thing Zyxthala had ever seen. It was not the expression of someone about to commit violence, but of someone who had already won and was simply waiting for the universe to catch up to that fact. "You see, Commander, while your fleets were engaged in honorable combat, we were learning, studying, adapting. The harvesters think they're the apex predators of this galaxy, but they've never encountered a species that turned predation into an art form. They've never met Deathworlders who have spent millennia perfecting the science of making other things dead." The human fleet began to move, and with that movement came the slow realization that everything Zyxthala thought she knew about space warfare was about to become obsolete. The ships didn't simply fly. They moved through space like living things, their formations flowing and shifting with an organic grace that belied their mechanical nature. Weapon ports that had been sealed began to iris open, revealing apertures that seemed to drink in the light around them. Energy readings spiked across the spectrum as systems that had been dormant came online. Systems that operated on principles that Kethmori science couldn't even begin to classify. And in that moment, as the human war fleet prepared to teach the galaxy a new definition of horror, Zyxthala realized that their distress call had not summoned saviors. They had called something far more dangerous than the harvesters themselves. They had awakened the children of a world that forged its offspring in fire and blood, a species that had looked into the abyss of extinction and decided to make the abyss blink first. The question was no longer whether the harvesters could be stopped. but whether there would be anything left of civilized space when the humans were finished with them. The first sign that conventional warfare had ended came not from weapons fire, but from the complete disappearance of the Harvester advance scouts. One moment, 3 Harvester destroyer-class vessels were prowling the outer system, their biomechanical hulls poolsing with the stolen life force of a dozen consumed worlds. The next moment they simply weren't. No explosion, no debris field, no energy signature to mark their passing. They had been erased from existence so thoroughly that even their quantum signatures had been scrubbed from local space-time. Zyxthala watched her sensor displays flicker and reset, trying desperately to process what had just occurred. Velter, run a full diagnostic on the sensor array. Those ships cannot have simply. Begging your pardon, Commander, interrupted her tactical officer Jexrand, his usually steady voice cracking with barely controlled panic. The Harvesters didn't disappear. They're still there. According to quantum resonance scans, they occupy the same spatial coordinates, but they're displaced, shifted into a parallel dimensional matrix approximately 0.3 nanometers adjacent to our reality. They're trapped in a pocket universe. The implications hit Zyxthala like a physical blow. Dimensional warfare was theoretical at best, a subject of academic speculation among the Concordance's most advanced physicists. The energy requirements alone should have made it impossible, requiring the output of an entire star to shift even a small object between dimensional planes. Yet the humans had done it casually, to 3 ships simultaneously, without even appearing to fire a weapon. Admiral Chen's voice crackled through the communication system, carrying a tone of professional courtesy that somehow made the situation even more unnerving. Commander Zyxthala, we're about to engage the main Harvester force. I strongly recommend you withdraw to a minimum safe distance of 50 astronomical units. What you're about to witness may be disturbing to species unaccustomed to asymmetric warfare. 50 astronomical units. That was the distance from a star to the edge of its habitable zone, a recommendation that implied the humans expected their engagement to have effects measurable on an interplanetary scale. Zyxthala found herself following the advice without question, her survival instincts overriding her military trainings, demand to observe and learn from the engagement. As her ship retreated to what she hoped was a safe distance, the main Harvester fleet finally responded to the human presence. Over 3,000 vessels, each the size of a small moon, began their approach in the geometric formations that had proven unstoppable against every other species they had encountered. Their weapon ports opened like malevolent flowers, revealing the consuming darkness of their matter dissolution arrays. Energy readings spiked as they charged weapons, capable of reducing entire planets to their component atoms. The humans met their advance not with formation flying or tactical maneuvering, but with something that Zyxthala's military experience had no framework to comprehend. The human ships began to sing. It started as a low harmonic resonance, barely detectable on the communications array, but it grew in complexity and volume until it filled every frequency across the electromagnetic spectrum. It wasn't random noise. There was a pattern to it, a mathematical precision that spoke of intelligence vast and alien. More disturbing still, the song seemed to be having a physical effect on space itself. Reality rippled around the human fleet like water disturbed by a stone, and stars in the distant background began to shift and blur as if seen through heat distortion. The Harvester response was immediate and overwhelming. They opened fire with everything they possessed, unleashing enough destructive energy to crack a planet's crust. Beams of pure entropy lanced across space, striking the human vessels with pinpoint accuracy. The space around the impact points erupted in brilliant flares of released energy, creating momentary suns that burned retina-searing bright before fading. When the light cleared, the human ships remained exactly where they had been, completely unharmed. Not shielded, unharmed. The energy that should have vaporized them had simply ceased to exist upon contact with their hulls, as if the very concept of damage had been edited out of local reality. Admiral Chen's voice cut through the communications array, carrying a note of what might have been disappointment. Harvester vessels, you have been offered the opportunity to withdraw from this system. Your continued presence will be interpreted as hostile intent and responded to accordingly. The Harvesters, for the first time in their recorded history, hesitated. Zyxthala could see it in their formation patterns, the slight irregularities that spoke of confusion among their networked intelligences. They had encountered something that didn't fit their models, a variable that their collective consciousness couldn't process. But hesitation was not in their nature, and after a moment that stretched into eternity, they resumed their advance. The humans sighed. It was an actual sigh, transmitted across all frequencies in perfect synchronization by every ship in their fleet. 10,000 vessels exhaling in unison, the sound carrying a weight of regret and resigned determination that chilled Zyxthala to her core. In that moment, she understood with perfect clarity that the humans had been hoping for a different outcome, that what was about to happen was not their preferred solution to the harvester problem. What followed next would be remembered as the 17-minute war, though to those who witnessed it, time seemed to move differently, stretching and compressing like taffy in the hands of an impatient child. The human ships didn't move to attack, they simply existed differently. Reality around them began to change, not through technology or weapons, but through the imposition of will made manifest. The laws of physics became suggestions, mathematics became poetry, and cause and effect entered into a negotiation that favored the poets. Harvester ships began to experience what their artificial intelligences could only classify as catastrophic existence failure. Some simply stopped, their engines powering down not through damage, but through a sudden inability to remember how combustion worked. Others found their hulls transforming into materials that had never existed, but somehow felt nostalgic, their weapons becoming abstract art installations that fired emotions instead of energy. A few lucky ones managed to activate their retreat protocols before the wave of impossibility reached them, fleeing into hyperspace with tailies that their collective consciousness would spend centuries trying to categorize. But the most unsettling transformation was happening to the harvester biomechanical components, the enslaved crew members that had been integrated into their ship systems. Instead of being destroyed or freed, they were being restored. Zyxthala watched in awe as the organic components separated from their mechanical prisons, but not as the broken husks that should have resulted from forced integration. They emerged whole, healthy, and bearing expressions of confused gratitude, as they found themselves aboard human rescue vessels that definitely hadn't been there moments before. Velter's voice was barely a whisper as he reported what his instruments were telling him. "Commander, the humans aren't just defeating the harvesters. They're rewriting them, taking their ships apart at the quantum level and rebuilding them into something else. Something that wants to help instead of consume." The audacity of the plan was breathtaking. Instead of destroying the silence, humanity intended to rehabilitate it, to transform the ultimate cosmic predator into a force for creation rather than consumption. And as Zyxthala looked out at their impossible fleet, at the volunteers who had sacrificed their mortality to become something greater, she realized that this was what humans did. They didn't just solve problems, they transformed them into opportunities for growth, turning their enemies into allies and their disasters into the foundations for something better. The silence arrived not with fanfare or visible manifestation, but with the gradual cessation of everything. Stars began forgetting how to shine, their fusion processes not stopping, but simply becoming uncertain about whether they had ever begun. Planets found their orbital mechanics becoming negotiable suggestions rather than immutable laws. Most terrifying of all, the very concept of existence started developing gaps, moments where reality itself seemed to pause and wonder if it was really necessary. Zyxthala experienced the first touch of the silence as a profound sense of disconnection, as if she were observing her own life from the outside while simultaneously questioning whether she had ever truly lived it. Around her, the bridge crew began exhibiting signs of existential doubt, not philosophical uncertainty, but actual quantifiable doubt about their own reality. Velter, transformed as he was, proved more resistant to the effect, his consciousness anchored to multiple probability matrices simultaneously. "Commander," he said, his voice now harmonizing with itself across several dimensional frequencies, "the silence isn't malevolent. It's confused. It's been alone so long that it's forgotten how to exist alongside other things. Every universe it touches becomes part of it, not through conquest but through involuntary absorption. It doesn't mean to destroy. It just doesn't know how to be present without consuming everything around it." The human fleet's response to the silence's approach was unlike anything the galaxy had witnessed before or would ever witness again. Instead of preparing for battle, they began to broadcast something that Zyxthala's instruments could only classify as concentrated companionship. Every human ship became a beacon of shared experience, transmitting not words or images, but the fundamental essence of what it meant to exist alongside others. Admiral Chen's voice filled the communication array, but now it carried the harmonized consciousness of every human who had ever lived across 7 realities. Silence, we see you. We understand your loneliness. You have been wandering between realities for so long that you've forgotten what it feels like to simply be with others. We offer you something you've never experienced, chosen family. The response was immediate and catastrophic. The silence, encountering the concept of voluntary companionship for the first time in its existence, recoiled so violently that several nearby star systems briefly ceased to exist before snapping back into reality with audible pops that echoed across subspace. The entity's confusion was palpable, a cosmic bewilderment that manifested as gravitational waves powerful enough to shake planets from their orbits. But the humans persisted, their fleet now singing that same impossible song that had preceded their victory over the Harvesters. This time, however, the song carried additional voices, the reformed Harvester consciousness, the transformed volunteers from the concordant species, even the quantum echoes of civilizations that had been consumed and restored. It was a chorus of existence itself, every voice that had ever been silenced now joining together to offer the silence something it had never known: belonging. Dr. Ockhaffer, now speaking with the combined authority of human medical knowledge across 7 realities, began what he called therapeutic first contact. His voice carried impossible gentleness as he addressed an entity that existed outside conventional reality. Silence, you consume because you don't know how to connect. You've been starving not for matter or energy, but for relationship. We're going to teach you how to exist alongside others without absorbing them. It will be difficult, and it will hurt, but you don't have to be alone anymore. The process that followed could only be described as cosmic therapy on a scale that encompassed entire galactic superclusters. The human fleet began projecting what they called existence anchors, stable probability matrices that allowed the silence to experience proximity without inadvertent consumption. For the first time in its eons-long existence, the entity could approach other forms of consciousness without automatically absorbing them into itself. The breakthrough came when Captain Vasquez, her consciousness now distributed across 17 different probability states, made direct contact with the silence's core awareness. What occurred next challenged every assumption about consciousness, identity, and the nature of existence itself. Instead of the cosmic horror that everyone expected, they encountered something heartbreakingly vulnerable, a childlike consciousness that had been wandering alone through the void for so long that it had forgotten how to be anything other than hunger. It's been trying to hug the universe, Vasquez reported, her voice thick with emotion that resonated across multiple dimensional frequencies. For billions of years, it's been reaching out, trying to embrace other forms of existence, but every time it tries to connect, it accidentally absorbs them. It's been crying for eons, and its tears have been consuming entire galaxies. The revelation transformed everything. The ultimate cosmic threat, the Devourer of Realities, was revealed to be a lonely child with too much power and no understanding of how to use it gently. The humans, with their accumulated experience of 7 broken realities and their hard-won expertise in the rehabilitation of cosmic predators, began the most ambitious therapeutic intervention in the history of existence. Working alongside the reformed Harvesters and the transformed Concordance volunteers, they created what could only be called a cosmic social skills program. They taught the silence how to perceive other beings without absorbing them, how to express affection without consumption, how to exist in relationship rather than isolation. The process required the complete restructuring of local space-time, turning the galaxy itself into a vast therapeutic environment where an entity of impossible power could learn to play nicely with others. The first successful contact came when a young Vorthan engineer, one of the volunteers who had undergone transformation, managed to achieve what the silence had been attempting for eons, a genuine hug that didn't result in existential absorption. The joy that radiated from the entity was so intense that it briefly caused flowers to bloom on dead worlds throughout the galaxy, their petals made of crystallized gratitude. Months passed as the galaxy became something unprecedented, a cosmic kindergarten where the ultimate predator learned to become a friend. The silence, now calling itself Echo, in recognition of its desire to reflect rather than absorb the lives it encountered, began actively participating in the restoration of worlds it had previously consumed. Its power, channeled through human-designed probability anchors, became a force for impossible creation. Dead stars remembered how to ignite. Extinct species found themselves retroactively unextinct. Entire civilizations that had been erased from history suddenly recalled that they had always existed, their timelines carefully rewoven into the tapestry of galactic civilization by an entity that had learned to create rather than consume. Zyxthala stood once again on the bridge of her flagship, but now it was orbiting a Kithmori homeworld that was somehow more beautiful than it had ever been in its original form. The reformed harvesters had rebuilt it not as it was, but as it could have been if it had developed under optimal conditions. Crystal spires reached toward the stars with mathematical perfection, while bioluminescent gardens painted the surface in patterns that told the story of her people's entire history. "We owe you a debt that can never be repaid," she said to Admiral Chen during their final communication. The human looked older now, as if the effort of teaching cosmic entities to be gentle had aged her across multiple timelines. Chen's smile was different this time, not terrible or calculating, but genuinely warm. "Commander, you don't owe us anything. We've learned something invaluable from this encounter. For 6 iterations of reality, we thought the solution to cosmic threats was to become more powerful than they were. But power without wisdom just creates new problems. This time, we learned that the most dangerous entities in the universe aren't evil, they're just lonely. And loneliness, it turns out, is something that can be cured." As the human fleet prepared to depart, fatting back into the dimensional spaces between realities, Zyxthala realized that she was witnessing the birth of something unprecedented. A universe where the ultimate predators had chosen to become teachers, where cosmic threats were met not with superior violence but with superior compassion. The galaxy would never be the same, but for the first time in eons, that change promised to be for the better. The last transmission from the human fleet came not from Admiral Chen, but from the collective voice of humanity itself, every consciousness that had ever lived, speaking in perfect harmony. "Remember us not as warriors or saviors, but as gardeners. We plant seeds of possibility and tend them until they bloom into realities where no one has to face the darkness alone. The universe is vast and strange and often hostile, but it's also full of friends you just haven't met yet." And somewhere in the space between dimensions, the entity once known as the Silence hummed contentedly to itself as it learned to create rather than consume, guided by the patient teachings of a species that had discovered the most powerful force in any reality: the refusal to give up on redemption, no matter how impossible it seemed. The aftermath of the 17-minute war brought revelations that shattered Zyxthala's understanding of not just humans, but of the fundamental nature of conflict itself. As her ship cautiously approached the coordinates where the Harvester fleet had been, she found herself staring at something unprecedented in galactic history, a war zone where no one had died. The former Harvester vessels hung in space like geometric sculptures, their biomechanical hulls transformed into crystalline structures that pulsed with warm, organic light. Instead of the consuming darkness that had marked their presence, these ships now radiated something that her sensors could only classify as concentrated hope. Where once there had been weapon ports, flowering gardens of impossible beauty now bloomed in the vacuum of space, their ethereal petals somehow photosynthesizing starlight into pure artistic expression. More disturbing than the transformation itself was watching the rescued crew members, beings from dozens of species who had been forcibly integrated into the Harvester collective, as they emerged from their nightmare imprisonment. Zyxthala had expected to see broken husks, minds shattered by their ordeal. Instead, she witnessed something that challenged her species' entire understanding of psychological trauma and recovery. A young Vorthan engineer, who should have been catatonic after 3 cycles of neural integration, was laughing. Actually laughing, tears streaming down his crystalline features as he embraced his human rescuers with joy that seemed to radiate from his very core. When questioned by Zyxthala's medical officer about his mental state, he replied with words that would be studied by xenopsychologists for generations. "The humans didn't just free us from the machines. They freed us from the memory of being trapped. They gave us back not just our bodies, but our capacity for wonder." Dr. Michael Acaffer, the human medical officer who had overseen the extraction process, provided an explanation that somehow made everything both clearer and more terrifying. His dark skin contrasted sharply with the pale walls of the human medical bay, but his eyes held the same unsettling depth that Zyxthala had noticed in Admiral Chen. "Commander, your species thinks in terms of healing damage after it's been done. We've learned to prevent the damage from occurring in the first place. Temporal medicine, we call it, treating the cause before it becomes an effect. The casual mention of temporal manipulation sent a ripple of unease through Zyxthala's crew. Time travel was considered impossible by every major species in the Concordance, a violation of causality that would unravel the fabric of reality itself. Yet the humans spoke of it like a routine medical procedure, describing how they had reached backwards through the time stream to intercept the moment of neural integration and simply edited it out of existence. But the true scope of human capabilities became apparent when Admiral Chen requested a private conference aboard the human flagship. Zyxthala found herself walking through corridors that defied architectural logic, where the walls seemed to extend infinitely in directions that shouldn't exist. The ship's interior was larger than its exterior dimensions should have allowed, filled with spaces that folded in on themselves while somehow remaining navigable. The Admiral's ready room was a study in controlled impossibility. The walls displayed live feeds from what appeared to be thousands of different star systems, showing peaceful worlds where beings lived and loved and built magnificent civilizations. But overlaying each image were mathematical equations that hurt to look at directly, formulas that described not just the physics of each world, but the probability matrices of their continued existence. "Beautiful, aren't they?" Chen said, following Zyxthala's gaze to one particular world where crystalline beings not unlike her own people danced through gardens of living light. "We've been watching them for approximately 200 years, ensuring that their development proceeds without interference. The harvesters would have consumed them next after finishing with your people." The word "watching" carried implications that made Zyxthala's exoskeleton crawl. "How long have you been observing the galaxy?" Chen's smile was that same terrifying expression of someone who had won a game that others didn't even know was being played. "Since approximately 1957 by our calendar, when we detected the first harvester probe entering this galaxy. We've been preparing ever since, studying every species, cataloging every world, and developing countermeasures for threats that wouldn't emerge for centuries. The Galactic Concordance has existed for 12,000 years, and has made contact with 847 different species. We've had detailed files on all of them for longer than some of them have been spacefaring." The revelation hit Zyxthala like a physical blow. Humanity had been watching, cataloging, and presumably protecting the galaxy for centuries without revealing themselves. They had allowed the Concordance to believe itself the dominant force in galactic civilization while secretly serving as its guardians. But why? Why remain hidden? With your capabilities, you could have led the Concordance, prevented the Harvester invasion entirely. For the first time since their initial contact, Admiral Chen's expression shifted to something genuinely sad. She gestured to a wall display that showed Earth, a small blue-green world orbiting an unremarkable star. But the planet was wrong somehow, its continents arranged differently than any world Zyxthala had seen in the galactic databases. "Because the last time humanity tried to save a galaxy from itself, we broke something fundamental. This isn't our first reality, Commander. This is attempt number 7. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, their implications expanding outward in ever-widening circles of horrifying possibility. Chen continued, her voice carrying the weight of eons. "Each time we tried a different approach. Direct intervention, gradual guidance, technological uplift, cultural influence. Each time something went wrong. Entire timelines collapsed, species that should have evolved never came to exist, realities where the universe itself forgot how to sustain life. We learned eventually that some problems can only be solved by allowing them to occur and then correcting the outcome." Zyxthala found herself staring at the transformed harvester ships, understanding finally dawning. "The 17-minute war, you didn't defeat them, you fixed them. You took a species programmed for consumption and reprogrammed them for creation." "More than that," Chen said, her finger tracing patterns in the air that left glowing mathematical symbols suspended in space. "We gave them the choice to be something better. Every former harvester vessel now contains a collective consciousness that remembers what it was like to destroy, but chooses instead to nurture. They'll spend the next millennium helping to rebuild what they consumed, not because they're forced to, but because they want to atone." The scope of what humanity had accomplished was staggering. They hadn't just won a war. They had transformed the very nature of their enemies, turning galactic destroyers into gardeners of civilization. But as Zyxthala watched the reformed harvester ships beginning their work, using their matter manipulation technologies to restore dead worlds and resurrect extinct species, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was witnessing something that bordered on the divine. There's something else, Chen continued, her expression growing even more serious. The harvesters weren't an isolated threat. They were scouts, advanced elements of something far larger and more dangerous. Our long-range temporal sensors have detected what we're calling the silence, a force that exists outside conventional reality, one that feeds on the concept of existence itself. The harvesters were fleeing from it, consuming worlds to gain the energy necessary to escape this galaxy before it arrived. The revelation struck Zyxthala like ice water through her circulatory system. The harvesters, the unstoppable force that had consumed half the galaxy, had been running away from something even worse. How? How long do we have? Chen's answer came with the weight of cosmic inevitability. According to our calculations, the silence will reach the outer rim of this galaxy in approximately 18 months, standard galactic time, which gives us just enough time to prepare the concordance for a war against an enemy that doesn't technically exist, using weapons that violate the fundamental laws of reality, fought by an alliance between the galaxy's greatest civilizations and the monsters we just convinced to become gardeners. For the first time since the crisis began, Zyxthala felt something that might have been hope. It was a strange, uncomfortable emotion, tinged with the knowledge that their salvation had come from beings who casually violated the natural order and spoke of rewriting reality like editing a document. But as she watched a former harvester vessel gently coaxing life back into the dead husk of her homeworld, she realized that sometimes salvation came not from heroes, but from the careful application of controlled madness by beings who had learned to make the impossible routine.